Well, good afternoon, and I am so excited to have Deborah and Brian here. They're going to be talking about their new book, Made for Learning, and there'll be links to this book and links to their materials in the blog entry itself. Deb has been a national independent literacy consultant and coordinator. She's worked with many different districts all around the country, and serving kids from diverse language and socioeconomic groups. And she has a website. Okay. Brian, oh my goodness, principal fellow at the University of Wollongong in Australia. He started teaching before I did. First time I've interviewed someone like that. I started in 70, he started back in 56. Oh my goodness. And he got to work with Marie Clay. I am absolutely so jealous about that. He completed his PhD at James Cook University. He's a Fulbright scholar, postdoctoral fellow at Harvard, a visiting fellow at University of Illinois and University of Arizona, and it goes on and on and on. We could probably fill a small room with his publications. And he likes to be one of those folks that do the research in a naturalistic mode, and he prefers that one of his preferred activities, of course, then is sitting in classrooms and watching teachers, real teachers teach. What a profession, I love it. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to jump right into the first question for you two. Do you mind sharing what the conditions of learning actually are with our listeners? And take it away.
Should I start, Brian?
Well, you start, Deb, yes.
Okay.
Ladies before gentlemen, yes.
Well, so, you know, the conditions of learning, they're a theory of learning, obviously, but I think of them as being the why behind what we do and the way that we do it. So in other words, it helps us to understand our reasons for choosing to do something in certain ways. You know, there's lots of different ways that people can go about doing anything, you know, like read aloud or shared reading or setting up your libraries. And the way that we go about that is really dependent on that belief system that we have. And so I think of conditions of learning as a belief system in that way. Brian, you want to add on into that thinking?
All I could add is from a researcher's perspective, the conditions of learning emerged from my original doctoral research, which was to examine the conditions that supported complex learning. And I looked around for a while for some examples of complex learning and decided that the most complex form of learning that is common to all humans, all societies, was learning to talk. And so I asked the questions. One of my research questions was, what happens in the real world that supports children learning this very complex way of thinking, this very complex knowledge, the structure of the language into which they're born at such a young age. You know, by the time they're about 5, they've got 90% of the language under control. They only have a little bit more to do. And so I spent 3 years following toddlers of different ages around recording, audio recording and doing field notes on from what happened to them from when they woke up in the morning till when they went to bed at night. I had a little recording device built into a little microphone that I attached to their clothes, and then I would just record what happened for a full day. And at the end of 3 years, I had mountains of data, and when I analysed them to see what was going on, it was those conditions which emerged, which I could find those themes in the data that I'd collected.
Okay, well, that's a very nice segue into the next question, which is, how are these conditions for learning universal? And either of you can take that on.
So we should probably also call out what the conditions are. So
Oh, my bad. Okay.
yeah, we should do, no, that's okay. That's okay. Cause we just, as we're talking. So one of the sort of central conditions that we talk about in the book is engagement. And I think we think so much, especially now when we're in all of this virtual world, we think about engagement really, really, it's got to be the biggest question or the question I've heard the most for the past year and a half with teachers. And so engagement, the way Brian talks about it, is defined by a set of principles. So first, that learners see themselves as doers of whatever it is that they're learning. So if you are learning to read, do you see yourself as a reader? Do you see yourself as a writer? Do you see yourself as a yogi if you're practicing yoga? Whatever you're learning, do you see yourself as that? And you understand the purpose of any of the demonstrations that you're of the person that you're learning from. You understand how those affect your life and why they matter. You feel free from any fear of any sort of humiliation or psychological harm or physical harm for any approximations that you make. And then the last piece, I think, which speaks so much to us in a classroom, is the relationship that the learner has with the community of learners in which they exist. So engagement's central. There is immersion and demonstration. Immersion being surrounded by and witnessing what it is that you're learning, and demonstration then being the artifacts and the actions that a learner would go through to complete whatever it is that they're learning. And so those two conditions are really central, because you don't learn something without a demonstration of it, right? That's very much a central part of learning. And then there are 5 additional conditions that Brian describes that basically create the tone, if you will, for how engagement, what gives rise to engagement. The first one is expectations, and expectations are about beliefs that the person who is demonstrating for you shows for you, as well as your own belief in yourself as a learner. And those have to be unconditional. I always love hearing Brian describe when he asked parents if they believed their child would learn to talk. And he said they looked at him like he was kind of crazy, right? And then when he would say, well, do you expect them to learn to read? They would be more hesitant. They would say, well, I hope so, or if they get a good teacher. So that's not quite the same kind of unconditionalness, if you will. Responsibility is another condition, that the learner is responsible for taking on the learning and making the decisions that a learner makes. Employment is practice and use. And then approximation, that's the one that I always held so dear to my heart in a classroom, especially when I was a kindergarten teacher, is that when we look at the approximations that children make, they show us what they have under control. They show us what they're curious about and what they're practicing and trying out as a learner. And then our response to that response is so critical to whether or not children, again, continue to engage with what it is that we're learning. So those 8 conditions are a real powerful framework for helping you to learn to look at your classrooms. But Brian, you've talked so much, we've had conversations about the different people who've contacted you about these universal conditions as well.
Yeah, the universality of the conditions, I realized from really 2 sources of information, Sam. Firstly, as Deborah suggested, when I first started writing and presenting about the conditions of learning, I would get lots of, in those days there was no email, I would get lots of faxes, I would get lots of snail mail letters from people who had either been at the presentation or read what I'd written, and they came from professors in quite different discipline areas. I remember the first one I got was from a professor of aerodynamic engineering at some very high-class university in America, who wrote to me and said, thank you. That's the way I learned to be learned what I learned. That's the way I learned to be a professor, and it's the way I'm going to teach my students from now on. I got lots of those kinds of letters. I got one from the son of a very wealthy restaurant owner, owned a chain of restaurants, high-class restaurants across the country, and particularly in New York City. And he wrote to me and said, that's how I learned to be a maitre d' at my parents' most expensive restaurant. I started off as, I think you call them water boys, where the only job he had was to wander around the tables and fill up the water jars. And from that kind of immersion and the demonstrations and responses he got from his parents and the other workers in the restaurant, he rose to become a maître d', and he learned it all through that particular kind of process. The second source of why I think it's universal is that what's emerged recently from some of the biological, neurobiological research is that as a species, we're the only one on Earth that can make meaning out of symbols. Humans are the only species on God's Earth that can create and communicate meaning using symbol systems. Oral language is the most dominant, but there are lots of symbol systems that we learn how to use. You know, Braille, sign, art, mathematics. And the fact that we're the only species on Earth that can do that means that we have been, evolution has chosen those particular abilities as a species survival behaviour. So it must be universal because as a species, irrespective of what language we learn or what culture we're born into or what society we're born into, we all learn to talk unless we're seriously neurologically impaired in some way. And even those who are neurologically impaired try desperately to learn how to talk. But if those conditions that emerge from my research aren't there, then they have a great deal of difficulty in learning to talk. And there's lots of research into what some people call feral children, children who are abandoned by parents or cut off from human contact. They have a great deal of difficulty in learning to use symbols to construct meaning. So those two sources of information have convinced me that it is a universal framework that applies to just about anything we learn. Although I was asked by a teacher once, how do you learn to make love? What demonstrations did you get for that?
Oh my. Okay, well, I'll just use that as a segue into the next thing. I can change my view. Yes, I will. So first of all, a quick editorial comment. Oh my gosh, you know, I've been a teacher and I've been a teacher of teachers, and this is such valuable information for teachers to know and to use. So and with that, and I mean, amazingly valuable things that can help everybody, whether you're experienced or inexperienced as a teacher. These are things that you want to make sure are happening. So that's a perfect segue into the next question, which is, how have these conditions of learning impacted your work as a teacher and a leader? And I'll leave that open to either of you.
Well, I mean, I can certainly speak to how it's impacted me because I was a first-year teacher when I read Brian's first book and the whole story. And I remember at the time it was, you know, I had learned in my teacher ed programs about how we needed to, you know, learn to look at what kids were doing and, you know, build on their strengths, and you hear that. But to put that into practice is really challenging, I think, as a teacher. because we're so, it's much easier, I think, to see all the things I need that are left open for me to teach. It's so much easier to see that. And I think when I read about the conditions of learning, I really began to appreciate that teaching is a response to a learner. It's not me first in a classroom, that what I've got to do is to learn to look at those approximations that kids make and recognize them as signs of learning, not as a problem or something I've got to fix. You know, that whole notion of filling in the gaps is a deficit mentality. You know, I've got to fill in and fix all the things that are wrong with those kids. It's that learning to notice those approximations and recognize them, that those are your most powerful sign of learning in a classroom, and how we look at that. And then the other thing I think that the conditions did for me was it helped me to have a language for explaining a lot of the decisions that I was making, to have a way of thinking and explaining, even to myself, whether it's explaining to someone else or not, but explaining to myself, why, if I do something in a certain way, do I get a certain effect? And if I do it in a different way, what effect might I get? And the conditions just gave me a platform and a framework for thinking to start with, but then also for being able to articulate out why I was choosing to do something in a certain way. So I think, you know, it's just I think as a teacher, there's nothing that we need more than really being able to talk about why we do what we do and the way we do, versus somebody else just telling us and we're trying to replicate. I always love that Brian talked about that when you're in a classroom, you're simulating the conditions, not replicating the conditions. Can you talk to that, Brian, that idea about simulation? I just always thought that was so powerful.
When I first started presenting about the conditions of learning, when you get your PhD and you want to share it with the world, and so I'd finished my PhD and was talking with a group of teacher colleagues, teachers that worked in schools near my university, and I said, look, I've just done this research, I've published a dissertation, I've identified these conditions that exist in the worlds of the children that I collected the data from. I'm wondering whether or not you guys can put them in place in the classroom and let me watch you. And so I began a long association with a group of teachers who gave me the privilege of sitting in their classrooms and recording and observing. And when I had the funds, I could videotape as well. And we would sit down and retrospectively look at all of the data I'd collected and talk about how you might put that in place in the classroom. And over the years, they gradually began to work out ways of taking the conditions that were in my doctoral thesis, which I think about 3 people in the world have ever read, and turn them into classroom practice. And I can remember one of the early arguments or one of the early discussions we had was from a couple of teachers who said, look, Brian, when a kid is learning to talk, it's almost a one-on-one situation. Caretakers have the time and the luxury of operating with a child on a one-on-one basis. We can't do that in our classrooms. We can't have a one-on-one situation. And it was then that I realized I had to make the distinction between simulating the conditions of learning in the classroom and replicating them. And I admitted to teachers, I know you cannot replicate the conditions that I noticed and that I observed and that emerged from my doctoral research. You can't have one-on-one situations, but we can try to replicate them. And that seemed to persuade a lot of teachers that I wasn't asking them to do something that some kind of airy-fairy academic had decided was a good thing for them. Once we clarified the simulation replication problem, they could move ahead. They were happy to simulate, but couldn't replicate. Yeah.
Okay, well, again, I really hope that all the teachers out there are listening carefully, because you're my kind of person, the kind of person that actually pays attention to teachers and listens to teachers, and you're not a top-down sort of a person whatsoever. You're in there and teaching them how to facilitate things, and that is so critical. So can you share with us now, some of the how you're thinking about your original theory in writing has changed over the years, and most especially, how do conditions of learning support meaning making rather than acquisition of knowledge? That probably sounds like Brian first.
I think so. Definitely a Brian question.
I'll let you off the hook there, Deborah. And here we go.
Well, one of the things that I've been researching in the last decade of my professional career was the role that metaphor played in framing how we think and how we behave around certain issues or topics or events. And by metaphor, I don't mean the kind of typical metaphors that people use in their language, like he's as strong as an ox, or she can run like the wind. What I'm referring to is what George Lakoff has referred to as deep or conceptual metaphors, what some other people have referred to as embedded metaphors. They're deeply embedded in our language, and they're so deeply embedded we're really not consciously aware of them. And I became aware of the fact that when I wrote the whole story, one of the subtitles was natural learning and the acquisition of literacy. And acquisition, the use of the term acquisition, is an example of one of those embedded metaphors. You think of the term acquisition, it's based on the verb to acquire, and you don't acquire nothing, you acquire something. And as soon as you start using language that talks about the acquisition of knowledge or the acquisition of literacy, then what you are doing is treating knowledge or treating literacy as some kind of stuff, some kind of material that has weight, that can be measured, that can be broken down into smaller bits and reassembled, that can be stored in different ways. And that metaphor suddenly forces you into a transmission of information model of teaching. And I contrasted that with what I call the discourse of meaning making. Unfortunately, the language of acquisition is embedded in the discourse of education. It has been for a couple of 100 years. Mainly it came through psychology. I remember Frank Smith said, education backed the wrong horse when it backed psychology. And when I pushed him on it and said, well, what should we have backed? He said, anthropology. Find out what happens in the real world and base your theories around that. Anyway, let me see. What I've been writing about recently is what I call the discourse of acquisition versus the discourse of meaning making, and how you choose your words, how you choose your basic embedded metaphors, the ones that you aren't really consciously aware of, affects how you behave around anything. And one of the last bits of research I did before I retired was with a group of teachers who agreed with me and said, how can we change the metaphors we use? How can we change the climate of the classrooms that we're creating through the language that we use? And one of the little experiments I gave them to do was, I said, well, let's think about one of the most common words or phrases that teachers in Australia, and I'm sure in America, use. And that is that you refer to what you want the kids to do in class as work. You know, get on with your work, good work. If you work really hard, I'll give you a koala stamp, you know. And I said, let's declare a moratorium on the use of work in our classroom language. Well, they tried, and the most that they could do was for about half an hour. It was too hard intellectually for them to be consciously aware of not to use the word work. And from there, we began to explore other ways of using language that emphasized meaning making rather than acquisition. And I think Peter Johnson is working, or has been working, along similar lines about how linguistic choice affects kids' perceptions of themselves as learners. It's all part of the same kind of study of discourse and the deep metaphors in the discourse that subconsciously affect how we behave around teaching or classrooms or whatever it is we're talking about or we're discussing.
When it comes out in the ways that you don't actually, like you don't think of it as being, of having such an influence on kids. You know, when you talk about, okay, your job today is readers, and I'm saying this because this is stuff I've said routinely. I have myself on video saying all of this. You know, your job today as readers is let's get on with our reading work. You know, our writing work today is, and it's interesting how once you become aware of the metaphors and you begin to question your own thinking about, do I really believe that reading is a chore? And if I do, that language sounds really good. But if I don't, is there a way I can shift that to talk about, you know, our thinking work, or see, I can't even get work out now. Our thinking today is, or we'll be thinking like mathematicians today, as opposed to our math work today. And it's so interesting because when you begin changing that inner dialogue, and then that dialogue that's coming out with kids, you begin to change the way you view your role in that learning relationship that you have in your classroom. And it's, I mean, this is the stuff that, you know, I always think you can be a really good, solid teacher, but the thing that pops people into that great category that Mary Howard talks so much, the good to great, is the language that we use. And it's such a huge piece of changing the way that we are with kids. Yeah.
Yeah, some of the teachers I worked with, Sam, would just make little subtle changes, like instead of saying, today we're going to learn math, well, you've gone again, Sam. Today we're going to learn biology. They would say things like, today we are going to make meaning like a mathematician would. Today we're going to make meanings like a biologist would. And they emphasize the meaning making rather than the acquisition of skills and knowledge.
I know that might explain. Okay, I put a piece of paper. My screen turned white earlier, and that I've been. That might explain what happened. But this is reminding me of some things we, for a number of years, at one of the universities where I taught, we had summer institutes, and that was exactly one of the things we did with the teachers at those institutes, is work on the language they use within the classroom and changing that language indeed, just as you would have said and predicted. Yeah. Helped them a great deal. Okay, let's get into the book. In your new book, Made for Learning, you highlight mismatches between theory and practice. What do you mean by that? And can you share an example of some common mismatches that you see? And how can teachers easily adjust their thinking and practice to meet the needs of students in more productive ways? And if you'll excuse me, I'm going to read that twice, just for the emphasis. And how can teachers easily adjust their thinking and practice to meet the needs of the students in more productive ways? What a wonderful question. I'll open that up to either of you.
So one of the things when Brian and I first began to write in the book, we started to talk about how, those challenges that teachers have in bringing the conditions of learning to life in a classroom. And we began to label when we would see those kinds of practices where we know that practice came out of a certain belief system. But when you apply a different belief system to the practice, it comes out in really strange iterations in classrooms, right? We've all seen this. And so one of the first one that we talk about in the book is this whole idea of leveling your classroom library. Levels, brilliant thinking work to help us understand an increasing complexity across text, right? And help us as teachers have a very, kind of quick and easy way and a framework for thinking, okay? Use them all the time. But then you go into classrooms and the classroom library is set up around levels. And those levels could be Fountas and Pinnell levels. They could also be those, 1.6, 1.8, 1.10 kind of leveling systems. And it's that idea that this is not really helpful for kids because kids don't know about levels. I mean, I work with teachers who sometimes they're not as clear on what all those levels means. And I don't know the difference between a 1.6 and a 1.10 in my own thinking. So how could I use that system? How could kids be expected to use those systems? So thinking about organizing your libraries around, topics and genres and the way that a bookstore would, because that's an accessible way of organizing our library. So it's that mismatch between a theory like leveling and a practice in the classroom that doesn't align. And so some of those kinds of mismatches, you think about what are some of the easy ways to adjust those. It's really understanding the thinking behind these practices. So if someone's coming in a professional development and saying, oh, here's what we're all going to do now, then it's our responsibility as educators to okay, so let's think about where did this come from and what's the belief system behind it. And if we organize it in this way, how is that going to help kids? How will it support our learners to be able to be independent? Because classroom libraries are set up for independent, right? As the example. So it's that learning to question what comes in. It doesn't mean to be not accepting of some different types of practices, because it's not about growing in that way, but it's about putting that thinking, putting your own thinking that you've done against some of that, some of these different kinds of things, because things are constantly evolving. But at the same time, if we don't understand the history behind it, quite often we don't know where it comes from, and we don't know, why someone would want to take on a particular theory or particular practice in that way. Brian, you want to talk to?
Yeah, I think in Sam's question, I think it was, how can teachers easily change their behavior?
Isn't that easy? I'm sorry.
And my initial response would be that it's not easy, because we've been so imbued and immersed in the discourse of acquisition. We find it very hard to break away from it. And one of the things that I found absolutely essential is that teachers need to be given the opportunity to honestly and authentically examine their beliefs and values about learning. And one of the workshops that Deborah and I do is to get teachers to really honestly think about something that's not school related, that they have learned successfully, like crocheting or cooking or skiing or something like that, and give them the chance to really think about what they did first, what they did next, what they did after that, and then be put into groups where they share these experiences with each other. And what we find happens is that whether you've been learning how to make formula for the baby or whether you've been learning how to crochet, your experiences are similar for successful learning. First of all, you have a need or a desire to want to learn. You get demonstrations, you ask questions of someone, you read a book, and so on. And once they're given the opportunity to examine these beliefs in a really honest and open way, where they're not really being judged about the validity of their beliefs, then we get them to think about laying the language of the conditions of learning over that same experience and then recounting it using the language of the conditions. And they find that they can do it. Doesn't matter what they're learning, they can talk about their immersion, the demonstrations, how they responded, the responses they got to their approximations. My favourite story is to explain to them how I learned to iron shirts at 54 years of age through the same process. So it's not easy, but unless you give teachers that opportunity and the time to really reflect on those values and beliefs, it's very difficult for them to make the shift from a transmission model to a meaning-making model.
And in professional development, it tends to be the, 1 hour once, and now we're all going to go out and take it on. So you don't get those conversations that so many of us, have gotten the luxury of having. I mean, I think about in my own career, I've always had people that I could talk with about whatever it was that I was learning. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's so true that we're not offered the time anymore as professionals to engage in those conversations. Yeah.
That gives me the perfect segue into the final question. And that is, how are the conditions of learning still or even more relevant today? So if each of you could speak to that. All yours again.
Well, I'll start us off on that one. So, I think like even now when we think about, you can't pick up a newspaper or open a blog or anything now without hearing about learning loss. And it's one of those kinds of topics and comments and beliefs that I think if you believe that learning is something that children engage in and that the brain is the organ for learning, right? And you can't not be learning. It doesn't make sense to think of learning loss. It just doesn't make sense to me because the kids have been learning. They have been learning differently or learning different things, but they're going to be bringing so much to schools. And so I think about as teachers, if we believe that learners are learning and that the conditions of learning exist in their environments, it's how do we support them to be able to grow on what it is that they're doing. I mean, it has such implications for what we're going to be thinking about as school begins in the fall, and just that notion of how do we move forward as opposed to trying to say, okay, I got to fill in all of these gaps because these learners just weren't learning. And that I think has such an implication that we believe that unless we're there, kids aren't learning, unless we we as professional educators aren't there, then the kids weren't learning. And so I think, just as a very relevant connection to things that we're reading about today, I think the conditions of learning are going to be even more crucial for thinking about how we set up our environments in the fall so that kids are able to capitalize on all the thinking that they have been doing in the past months.
Yeah, my take on that, Sam, is what's happening in universities. And I think this is pretty universal. It's not just in Australian universities, but universities are designed architecturally and structurally to support a transmission of information mode of learning. You have large lecture theatres which hold up to 200 people, and some expert comes in and talks at them for 50 minutes, transmitting his wonderful information. Students take notes, go away, summarise the notes, and then regurgitate them when the exams are on. And I think that has to change. I've been arguing, before I retired, I argued a lot with the administration of my university that they had to really, instead of going from what they called a theory into practice mode of learning, you go to the lectures, you get the theory, and then you get a period of practice teaching, and you take that theory to the school for your internship, and you turn theory into practice. You see how it's done. I began to argue with them because I was pretty old and had been there a long time and was fairly senior. I began to argue with them that we need to reverse that. Universities need to start thinking about, particularly in professional courses like medicine or teaching or law, we should reverse that process and go from practice into theory. And in my last decade or so at the university, they allowed me to do that. I was given a group of about 24 students who enrolled in all the same subjects as mainstream students, but instead of going to lectures, they went to schools for 3 days a week. I taught them the skills of anthropology. They did classroom anthropologies. And then they came back to what we call a homeroom at the university, and they shared what they'd seen and then compared it with the prescribed reading that the students who are in mainstream had to do. And they learned more about teaching and developing a theory base than any mainstream student could learn. In fact, they used to what I call ace the system. In those semesters when they were enrolled in normal mainstream subjects, they applied the practice into theory mode of learning, and by getting mentioned on dean's lists and getting high distinctions at a rate that was statistically very significant. In fact, my colleague and I, who ran the course, got a national award as the most significant curriculum change over the last 5 years in university teaching. So my thinking is we need to get universities to change how they teach. Instead of going from theory to practice, let's work out how to go from practice into theory. And a lot of the practice-based learning that you see coming, being introduced now into medical schools and other professions is really based on that notion. Let's immerse them in the practice and work backwards to the theory. But unfortunately, when I left university, I didn't put in place a plan for someone to sustain the impetus that we developed, and so it just died. I'm afraid many of my colleagues at university love being the centre of attention and giving lectures on a stage for 50 minutes.
Well, I'll get on my platform for just a moment and say, as we look at the whole issue of how literacy should be taught, one way of going at it would be teacher-proof curriculum and let's make sure that we're, by gosh, if it's Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, you better be at this place in the curriculum. Thank you very much. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it would be empower teachers in the manner you're speaking of, and to teach teachers how to be that empowered person that not only that knows how to help and facilitate learning, and to create those facilitators. I think you can guess which side of that bridge I'm going to jump on myself. But with that, now that I've been on my thank you for allowing me to be on my soapbox for just a moment. And any final thoughts now, because this has been incredibly engaging, and for practicing teachers out there, please, please, please do have a look at this book, do have a look at these principles. I think they'd help teachers in any subject area become better teachers. And it's about the fundamental learning process, empowering teachers, in my view. So that said, any final thoughts from either of you?
I just hope that, I think I was so fortunate to come along at the time that I did as a teacher when, Brian's work was available to me. And I think it's the kind of a book that when you read it, that it changes you. You feel it. I mean, you begin to see it immediately in the way that you begin to interact with kids and do that work. And so I think my hope is that as teachers read the book, that they can see themselves, sometimes it's those very subtle little changes that you're making, but I think just recognizing that when you are responding to the kids that are in front of you, that's the satisfying kind of work. I mean, teaching's hard enough as it is, that everything shouldn't feel so hard. But I think if when you really feel the connections to kids, and that kids, they know that they can trust you, they know that they can trust you to be that person who's going to support them. You can put up with all the hard work that goes into teaching. It's like it makes it all worthwhile. So I just hope that as teachers, if they're reading the book, that they can feel that Brian and I have both been in the trenches down there doing that work, and it's the kind of feeling that you take with you when you work with kids. So that's what I wish for teachers.
Yeah, and my wishes are very similar, and I urge teachers to think about how they can organise their space that they have in the classroom, and the time they have in the classroom, and the resources and routines that they want to apply in the classroom. How can they align those with what evolution has produced in human neurobiology? How can they use the time they have with kids to provide opportunities for them to make meaning using symbols and communicate those meanings with peers? And that requires a whole new way of behaving and creating the climate of the classroom where you want this learning to occur. Think about how you organise your space, your time, your routines, and your resources, so that kids are continually making meaning and communicating those meanings with each other, because that's what evolution designed us to do.
Okay. Thank you both so much. Teachers out there, please, Made for Learning, How Conditions of Learning Guide Teaching Decisions, all the things that we talked about are there. Certainly, I have my copy. So sure hope you all get yours. And so thank you very much. Brian from Australia, by the way, have a nice breakfast. Does everyone realize it? Poor Brian. What time did you get up to do this morning, Brian?
3:30 a.m. tomorrow.
Ow. Okay. And Deborah, you're there in the California coast. You're not that far from my time. But thank you so much. And I hope my readers do have take advantage of the links in the blog and the rest, and have a look at this book. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The traditional Bomberito ending here is the Zoom wave. So if we could please all give the Zoom wave, and goodbye.
Okay.
Okay. Now,